We have been in a series called Favorites, and every message so far has been from the Old Testament. And next week we start with the New Testament, but we want to conclude today with a passage of Scripture that is a favorite for a lot of people, and it has good application for us today as well. If you're looking at one of the Bibles in front of you, you're not sure where the book of Esther is, then I'm going to ask you to turn to page 775 because you'll be able to find it that way, and you can follow along as we go through the message this morning, if you'd like to do that. And also a little bit later on in this message, if you'll turn your bulletin over, you'll find that there's an outline there, and you can fill in words in the blanks there. Also, if you'd like to do that, and it might help you as you take it home with you or go through those 5 questions at the end as well. You know, Meghan Markle is a name that probably most people around the world know right now. Now, that didn't used to be the case. She was an actress in Hollywood, and certainly there were people who knew about her, and she had a certain amount of fame to her name. But after she got the opportunity to meet Prince Harry in England, and they began to develop a relationship, started going together, then people around the world began to know about her. The news media were just really looking at this as almost like a fairy tale story. And it was so exciting. And then they got married a few months ago, and of course it's really a big thing. You still see them all over the internet and different places, and people just don't seem like they can get enough of the story for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Now, we've learned some things about her. We've learned what her life was like before she met him. We are learning what her life is like as she's adjusting to become a part of the royal family, and some of the do's and don'ts of that she's kind of learning to navigate along the way. We also learned some other things about her. We learned that she is not from England, that she's an American. We've learned that she also has her family over here still. We also know that she's still an American citizen and that she is of a mixed race for that matter. She isn't the typical candidate for royalty that you would expect there in England, but we certainly are finding that she's bringing a unique twist to the way life is done over there. And that's pretty cool. And I hope that they're very happy for the rest of their lives together. Well, today, as we dig into this passage in this book called Esther, we're going to see the story of another young woman who became royalty as well, unexpectedly to her. And she was put into this position also having some things from her past that were a bit different as well, that would almost seem to disqualify her in this foreign country. She was of a different race. Her family was from a different country. She came to the throne in unique circumstances, not in a typical way that we would assume someone is going to come to the throne. And as we read her story today, as we go through it together, we're going to find that God was working behind the scenes, directing a lot of things that were taking place throughout that book. And so I hope that it's an encouragement to you as we go through this story together, and then as we find application for it at the end as well. Here's how everything kind of came down. King Xerxes, and your Bible might say Ahasuerus, but King Xerxes was a man who had been in power for a relatively short time, but he ruled in Persia over 127 provinces that reached from Ethiopia to India. I mean, a wide-ranging space of where he was ruling. He lived in a citadel in Susa, which is the capital of Persia. And as the story unfolds, we find that he's been holding this party that is lasting for 6 months. That's a long party to have. And at this party, there are military leaders and princes and nobles, and they're having a good time during this whole time. I mean, this is a guy that has means, he has wealth, he has power, he has authority, and so this party has gone on for 6 months. And at the end of it, you'd imagine he'd be all partied out. But the Bible tells us that a short time after this, he had another 7-day party. And this party was for all of the men of the capital city of Susa. And it was basically a drinking party that was taking place during that time. And as this 7-day party eventually got really going, then it became kind of this alcohol-fueled thing that was people were making decisions that weren't the best, and the king was among them. He decided he wanted to spice up the party. So he thought, you know what, I want to entertain these guys. I'm going to have the Queen Vashti, come in and display her beauty for them. Now, Queen Vashti got the message about this, and she had been hosting the women of Susa in a party of their own. And when she heard that the king was commanding her essentially to go before all the men, she refused to do that. Well, that flew all over Xerxes. He did not like that. He didn't like being embarrassed in front of all the guys there, and he felt that she was being disrespectful, and all these guys that are his advisors began to grumble together. Why, if this happens to influence the other women of the kingdom, none of them will be obeying their husbands. And so they knew they had to do something to kind of cause her some pain. And so they suggested that maybe Xerxes might kick her out from being the queen and never allow her back into the palace again. And here he is. He's got this alcohol-fueled brain. He's not thinking clearly. He thinks, yeah, that's a good idea. All right, I'll kick her out. And so the word goes back to Vashti that she is banished from the palace, that she is no longer the queen. And obviously, that probably didn't go over very well with her either. We don't know too much about her after this time. In fact, very, very little. But we do know that a short time after this, that Xerxes got into this 2-year battle with the Greeks. That's not found in the scriptures, but history books tell us about the fact that he had some wars that he was involved in. And this 2-year battle was not going in his favor very often. Occasional skirmish he might win, but really he was kind of on the losing side of this. And when he got back to Susa, it tells us that he began to miss Vashti. He began to reconsider what he had done by kicking her out. And so it was suggested to him that maybe the good thing to do would be to call out to all the 127 provinces of the kingdom and to have all these beautiful virgins from these provinces brought in so that they might be the potential to follow up after Vashti. And the king thinks that's a great idea. And as the word is starting to go out, we are introduced to 2 other people in this story. The first one is a man who is a Jewish man. His name is Mordecai. And he has a cousin, and her parents have passed away. And he has raised her kind of as his daughter. We know her name in Scripture here initially is Hadassah. But we know her better as Esther, and Esther means star. You may be familiar with the drama that we've had here several times called The Star Queen that Tommy and John Thomas Oakes have performed for us. And that really displays the story well of this whole thing that took place there in Susa and all that will follow in my message as well. But we find that Hadassah, or Esther, in the description of her in Scripture, it says, lovely in form and features. And this edict goes out in the kingdom, and all of these beautiful young virgins are brought to the capital city for the king. Now, what was going to happen is each one of them, until the king said stop, was going to have to spend the night with him. And the thing is if he didn't ever call her back, then she was done. That was it. He never wanted to see her again. But at the same time, if he thought this is the one, then she became the queen. So it tells us that Esther was one of those ladies, those girls that was chosen to go before the king. And Mordecai comes along. He's watching over her. He wants to make sure that nothing is going to happen to her that would be bad. And so the guy that is the eunuch of the king sees Esther. He says, this is a special individual. And so he gives her 7 attendants to take care of her. He gives her a special place to live. She gets special kinds of food as well. And she is going to receive the best of the beauty treatments. Now, the Bible tells us they're supposed to be receiving these beauty treatments for a year's time. It does not give us a record of how much Elizabeth Arden or CoverGirl makeup was used during that time. But my guess is the companies are still going on all of those profits today, from all that was used there in the Capitol. So we find that in this, that there was no expense that was spared, and Esther is receiving the best of the best along the way. Now, when a girl was taken to Xerxes, she spent that evening. She wouldn't return if the king did not summon her by name. And so we find that there were a few that were brought to the king and never did make the cut, so to speak. But after this time, we find that Esther was going to be brought. Now, there's an important thing for us to understand. Mordecai told Esther, do not reveal your nationality. Now, there were lots of Jews that were there in the kingdom. They had been brought there through the Babylonian exile, and they had stayed there, many of them, and so it was common to have Jewish people in that particular area in Persia. And yet at the same time, Mordecai says, don't tell anybody that you are Jewish. Now he's saving this up for an opportune time right here. He's got some wisdom that God is giving to him, even though he doesn't realize it's coming from God at this point. So Esther's not going to reveal her nationality. And the day that she goes before King Xerxes, we find that he sees her, that he believes she is beautiful. He says in his heart, this is the one right here. And so she wins his favor. She wins the favor of everyone else in the palace area, and she is taken into the king's residence in the 7th year of his reign. Xerxes saw her and said, this is the one. And guess what the king did after this? He threw another Persian party, okay? And so all of the people of this area are having this party. They're celebrating together. A new queen is on the throne, a big party celebration, a holiday for everyone. But not all was wonderful in the kingdom. There was this political deep state. You know, we hear about the term deep state a lot today in the news. Under the cloak of secrecy, a plot was hatched to do away with the king by killing him. There were a couple of people who were supposed to be serving the king, but they're plotting to take his life. And as they're talking about this, they think that no one else is hearing them, but someone is. And that someone is Mordecai, the Jew. And Mordecai tells Esther, hey, these guys want to kill the king. And Esther then tells Xerxes, who has these guys executed. They're hung out there and gotten rid of. Now, that's a good thing. But what we find is this was recorded in a book called the Book of Annals. There were several books, but this is the most up-to-date book that they had. So it's written into the Book of Annals. And so nothing happens to reward Mordecai at that point. You would think that he would remember this and say, oh yeah, let's take care of this guy who let us know this was going to happen. But it doesn't happen at that point. But we're going to see that God was at work in this situation right here. Now, after this takes place, there's another bad guy that's been brought into the story. And this bad guy's name is Haman. And Haman is he's an Agagite, okay? An Agagite. And you might think, well, that doesn't mean much to me. Well, let me tell you why that might mean something to you once you hear why that's there. There's an interesting backstory here about something that's been eating at Haman for a long time. Because hundreds of years before, when Saul was the king of Israel, he was doing battle against the Amalekites, and there was King Agag, who was the leader of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were a people who were the first ones to refuse Israel to go through them to be able to get to the promised land. And God said, look, I want you to take care of them. I want you to eliminate them. And so Saul is doing battle against them, and he's, instead of wiping them all out and getting rid of even their animals, he chooses some of the animals to save, and he saves King Agag, just kind of as a favor in a sense. Now Samuel, the prophet, shows up. He's hearing the sound of animals, and he's saying, what's going on here? And he sees there's King Agag standing there, and he gets all over Saul and says, you were not supposed to allow this to happen. He goes over and he kills Agag. And there are 400 Amalekites who are there who are able to escape. And Haman is a descendant of one of those 400 Amalekites. He's been holding a grudge against the Jewish people as long as he's been alive. He has been looking at them and looking askance at them. They are bad people. He's really been not very happy even to be around them at all. And what is really now getting to him is that he is a guy with a big ego. He is a guy who enjoys people coming up and fawning all over him. He enjoys it when people are bowing down in front of him, just like, he thinks, all right, I'm something special. And he was. He was the second in command in all of Persia. He expected people to bow down before him. But there's one individual who is not bowing down before him. That is Mordecai, the Jew. He refuses to do that because he does not have any kind of respect for Haman. He has a sense that Haman is not a good guy. And so Haman plots this thing out where he's going to not only take the life of Mordecai, he is also going to wipe out all of the Jews in all of the kingdom. And so he goes down to this place where they throw dice. The dice in that kingdom were called Pur, P-U-R. And so he says, I'm going to have these guys throw the dice, And when they come up a certain way, I'm going to be able to determine what month and what day of the month that we are going to be able to host our first annual Kill a Jew Day, okay? And so he goes down, he watches these guys throw the dice, they roll, and it's the 12th month, the 13th day of that month. So it's almost a year from when he is having them do this. He goes, after this time, having this knowledge, he goes to the king. He says, King Xerxes, now there's a group of people in this kingdom who are just doing their own thing. They don't abide by our customs. They are a people who even are a threat to you, and if I were you, I would try to eliminate them and then divide up all of their properties, making sure that other people get those. And so the king, without really thinking it through, says, sure, that sounds like a good idea. If there are people out there against me, I don't want them around. And so here we find Haman has got this he's hatching this plot to be able to exterminate a whole group of people who are there in that kingdom. Now, as we think about this, we understand that it's not just an ancient thing about trying to eliminate the Jewish people. You know, there's a place called Iran today, which is what Persia became. Persia is now Iran. And listen to what some of the leaders have said about Israel. Hassan Nasrallah, a leader of Hezbollah, it says, if the Jews all gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide. Nasrallah also said, Israel is our enemy. This is an aggressive, illegal, and illegitimate entity which has no future in our land. Its destiny is manifested in our motto, death to Israel. Mohammed Hassan Rahimian says, we have manufactured missiles that allow us, when necessary, to replace Israel in its entirety with a big Holocaust. Now, history tells us that there was an actual Holocaust which occurred in World War II that Adolf Hitler brought about, trying to exterminate the Jews there. Haman was kind of an Adolf Hitler and modern-day leader of Iran rolled into one person, a man who hated the Jewish people, who wanted to see them destroyed, and his clever plot to do that is something which he thought was almost unstoppable because the king had issued an edict about this. Now, couriers went out, and 127 provinces all received this word that on the 13th day of the 12th month that the Jews were supposed to be fair game. They couldn't even defend themselves. They're just supposed to stand there and take it, you know, and then people could come in and take their stuff. Now, that's a pretty bad thing for the Jews, and for those that didn't like them, it sounds like a pretty good deal. People were chomping at the bit to wait for that day to be able to eliminate that race or that group of people. When Mordecai heard this terrible news, he said, this is bad. I've got to be able to get the queen's attention. So he goes to the courtyard. He's wearing sackcloth and ashes. And it was a law. You were not supposed to be in the courtyard with sackcloth and ashes. The king didn't want that around. So when Esther finds out he's out there like that, dressed that way, she sends some clothing down to him to put on so that he won't be in trouble with the king. But instead of putting it on, he sends back a message. And he tells her the time has come when it's time to reveal who you are, to make sure that something gets to the king so he understands that you are Jewish. We need to save our people. Esther knew the protocol about approaching that king. She knew that there were those who approached him without making an announcement that they were coming. And when they stood there, if he did not raise the golden scepter, they were put to death. She had not seen him for 30 days. She knew that he was sometimes a little irrational. She wasn't sure how she'd be received. And so she said, we have got to pray about this. So she gathered her ladies who were there, and she said, we're going to pray for 3 days. We're going to fast also. The word was sent out to all the Jewish ladies in the kingdom, all the Jews, in fact, that they were supposed to pray and fast for those 3 days. And at the end of 4 days, she was going to go forth with the king. Now, Mordecai sent this message to her, and it inspired her. It encouraged her. It gave her a boldness, a sense of courage to even make this decision to do this. And we're going to put the words up on the screen here in a second from chapter 4, verse 14. I would like for you to read it out loud with me, if you would, please, okay? Here we go. It says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. She said to herself, at the end of this 3 days, and I go to see him, if I perish, I perish. But she was willing to do it. She was willing to step out. And so when she goes there, the king says, well, why are you here? He accepts her. He raises that golden scepter, and she comes up and he says, what would you like? And she says, well, the reason I'm here is I want to invite you and Haman to a banquet at my apartment this afternoon. The king is excited about this. He knows he's going to get some good food there. And so Haman gets the word. And both of those guys show up at her house, at her apartment, a little bit later on. And there they are in the meal, and the king says to her, well, I know you've invited me here for some reason. I'll give you even up to half my kingdom. What is it that you would like to have? And she says, well, I'd like for you and Haman to come back again tomorrow to my house for another banquet, another party. And so once again, they say, sure, we'll do that. And I'll tell you what, Haman left that place feeling very happy. He's had the opportunity now, once to be in the king and queen's presence in her apartment. Nobody else gets the chance to be with both of them in her apartment. And he's feeling like, man, I have reached the pinnacle. I am so successful. He's walking on air as he leaves to go towards his house. But along the way, there's this one guy that is the fly in the ointment for him, and that is Mordecai. He sees Mordecai, and that smile on his face just goes into a frown. He does not like Mordecai. Mordecai is still not bowing down to him. It just rankles him all the way home. But he gets home, starts talking to his wife. He says to her, hey, I am such a lucky guy. I'm so wealthy. I've made it to the second position in the kingdom. I've got 10 sons. I've got great wealth. The king has honored me and elevated me. And this Jew, this Mordecai the Jew, is stealing my joy. His wife makes a suggestion, kind of coincidentally, if we want to call it that. She suggests that he has a 75-foot tall gallows built in the backyard so that Mordecai could be hung out there. And Haman says, wow, where have you been all my life? That's a wonderful idea. And so he gets these guys together, and they begin to build these 75-foot tall gallows. And I'm sure that Haman had a smile on his face as he went to bed that night. We're going to see some pieces of the puzzle begin to come together here pretty quickly of what God was working here. It's like God is playing chess in a sense. He's moving people around in different circumstances and situations. So the 75-foot gallows is built during the night. We find that Haman gets up early and he is heading over to the king's place, but the king has had trouble sleeping that night. Don't know if it was something in the food or what, but in reality it was God who was keeping him from sleeping very well. And he said, hey, I need something to help me to go to sleep. I need something boring to be read to me. Get out that book of annals and start reading to me some of the things so I can go back to sleep. And so one of his people go to that book, they bring it out, they open it right up to the place where it talks about Mordecai the Jew, who had told about the plot that was hatched against the king's life and how Mordecai, or how the king had been saved by that. And the king is like, he just sets up in bed straight and he says, wait a minute, did we ever honor the person who did that? Did we ever honor Mordecai? And the person says, no, you never did. Around that time, we find that Haman comes walking into the king's library. Talk about this timing. It's all very cool how this all fits together. And the king says to Haman, what should be done for someone the king delights to honor? Haman thought he was talking about him. You know, his ego was kind of getting in the way. He's like, all right, wow, man, I'm going to get boosted up here so I can kind of pick and choose what I want to do right here. So this is what Haman says. For the man the king delights to honor, have them put a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. And then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. The king commanded Haman at once, go and do that for Mordecai. Oh man, talk about irony right here. Talk about God's divine sense of humor right here. Haman did this. He led him around this town on this horse. He's got this royal robe on him. He's got the scepter. He's got all this kind of stuff. He's having to shout it out to everybody. This is what the king does for a man he wants to honor. And he is just feeling lower than a snake's back because he thought it was going to be him on that horse. Thought it should be him. And the fact it's Mordecai makes it even worse. And so he gets done. he goes back and he gets ready to go to the queen's house again. He goes to the queen's place. There's the king waiting for him as well. And they go in and they're having their meal. And the king says, the second time being here, and yesterday you didn't tell me what it is you want. Well, what is it that you would like from me? Is there something I can do for you? And she says, yes, Xerxes, there's something you can do for me. There's something you can give me. Give me my life and the life of my people, for we are about to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. You can imagine the surprise that the king received at that point. He didn't know she had a people. He didn't know anything about her background right here. And you should have seen Haman's face, and I would have liked to have, because my guess is that every one of those words, destroyed, killed, and annihilated, was a slap, 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 just like that to him. And he's thinking, uh-oh, something bad is about to happen right here. And the king asked who the person was who was doing this evil thing. And Esther says, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Can you imagine her pointing her finger at him, and Haman just kind of beginning to shrink down right there, because he knows that this is going to be the end for him. That is it. Haman is terrified by this. The king goes out on the ledge of the porch out there, and he's kind of seething out there. He's really angry, and Haman is begging for his life before the queen. And in fact, he is so begging that he gets over close to her. She's on the couch, and he kind of just falls on her right at the same time that the king comes walking in and says, what? Here you are? You're even molesting my wife? What's going on here? He calls for the guards, and the guards come in. They put this hood over the head of Haman, and the king is thinking, what am I going to do with him? And there was one of those guys who I'm sure was very, very close to Haman, who said, his wife told him to build a gallows 75 feet high in his backyard. Why don't you hang him on that? And the king says, great idea. Take him out there and do it. So that's exactly what happened. Haman was exalted in a way. He was lifted up, but he didn't live to see any kind of joy from that. Psalm 7, verses 14 through 16 say, he who is pregnant with evil and conceives trouble gives birth to disillusionment. He who digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit he has made. The trouble he causes recoils on himself. His violence comes down on his own head. And it did. Obviously, he was put to death there. Now, Mordecai is now put in charge of the position that Haman had. And he's given the signet ring of the king. And it's interesting because the Persian kingdom now has a Jewish queen and a Jewish prime minister. And you would think things were going to be a lot better for the Jews, and they should have been, except for that edict that was still out there about kill a Jew day. And that was still a few months away, but they knew this was a terrible situation. And if a king gave some type of an edict like this, it was irretrievable, irreversible. And so they didn't know what to do. But the king said, you know what, I cannot remove that, but Mordecai can write a new edict which will cancel it out, which will help it to be overcome. And so Mordecai writes out this new edict, and it says the Jews are able to defend themselves and to strike back at anyone who wanted to harm them, and they could even take the property of those who are doing that. And the news is sent out to all the 127 provinces. When the big day came on the 13th and 14th days of Adar, the 12th month, the tables were turned. Instead of the Jews being wiped out, we find that they are able to defend themselves, and they were continually victorious for 2 days. And even today, the Jewish people celebrate a feast called Purim. You've probably heard of that before. Pur is that dice that Haman had rolled to determine the dates for the Jews to be exterminated. And in an ironic twist, we find the Jews are calling the dates Purim, which is a plural of Pur. And each year, as this celebration takes place, they, at the end of it, read the story of Esther out loud. And whenever the group is gathered together and they're hearing the story of Esther, when they hear the names Mordecai and Esther, there's cheering and applauding. Whenever the name Haman is read, there's booing and there's hissing. Even today, because of the great victory that God gave, even though God's name is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. Now, there's some valuable lessons for us, and if you'll follow along, I'll try to give these to you relatively quickly, because I know we've been sitting for quite some time. First of all, the providence of God is always active. The providence of God is always active. This is a book that, as I say, did not mention God at all, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't working behind the scenes or above directing how things were going. A person could read the book of Esther and say, wow, what a bunch of coincidences that took place. But I want you to know these are godly coincidences, if you want to call them that. God was directing things and making things happen. It was providence at work, and providence means that God is working behind the scenes. I love what Paul wrote in the book of Romans chapter 8, verse 28, where he said, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. We know that God is working even when we don't see him. God was working in Bible times. God is still working today. And even when you're going through a time of relational stress or unemployment or financial meltdown, he is still working. He's still working despite the threat of terrorism and through frustrations in our families or our jobs. He's still working in the face of cancer or divorce or identity theft or any other kinds of things that we might deal with. God is working even when we can't see him or the plan. He was working behind the scenes when Esther became the queen. He was working behind the scenes when Mordecai overheard the plot to kill the king and made that known. He caused the king to have insomnia so he couldn't sleep at night, so that he would read from the book of Annals and find out that Mordecai had not been honored. And he also was working when Haman's wife suggested 75-foot tall gallows be made in the backyard. See, God was at work throughout all of that, directing those steps. I love what it says in Psalm 121, verse 4. It says, now to the God who never slumbers, who never sleeps, to the God who knows you're coming in and you're going out, to the God who hovers around you to preserve you from harm and to give you the future he's planned for you. To our great and good God be glory and praise forever. Amen. So God is not absent in the story of Esther. He is not absent in your story either. It's important for us to know that. Because sometimes we think, oh yeah, he was doing that back in Old Testament times. Oh yeah, he does that in other people's lives. No, he does it in your life as well. God is able to direct your steps and make a huge difference for you. It's amazing the number of things that happen that we really think are coincidental. But God is behind those things. So there's a second thing right here. God often reveals his will by putting us in an unexpected situation. Esther did not even have any kind of idea she would become the queen there in the Persian Empire. And a lot of sermons focus on Mordecai's words, for such a time as this. And rightfully so. Those are powerful words. They are words that need to be embedded in our thinking about where we are at this particular time. But at the same time, there's something else he asks her, and he says, who knows but that you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? What kingdom is he talking about? Is it God's kingdom? Not at that point, because remember, God is not mentioned there. He's saying that you have come into the Persian kingdom, into this circumstance with this king for a time like this. And he's implying that God has opened the doors for that to happen. And that's exactly what he has done. It's the kingdom of Persia at that time for her. Let me ask you, where is God maybe leading you right now? What is God leading you into in your own personal life? Is it something at work where he is leading you to talk to somebody about faith or to help somebody in a certain situation? Maybe you see a family that's struggling and God may be saying, I've put you in this particular spot right now so you can see what's going on over there, so you can make a difference, a positive difference in that family. I've brought you into this other situation, brought you into this church to be able to serve in a certain way. And this is why I brought you here, to be able to accomplish that particular goal. You see, for us, God is at work. You know, there's a story that was written called Jayber Crow by a guy named Wendell Berry. He was a farmer in Kentucky. And this is what he wrote about God's guidance. He said, often I have not known where I was going until I was already there. I have had my share of desires and goals, but my life has come to me, or I have gone to it mainly by way of mistakes and surprises. Often I've received better than I deserved. Often my faintest hopes have rested on bad mistakes. I am an ignorant pilgrim crossing a dark valley. And yet for a long time, looking back, I've been unable to shake off the feeling that I have been led. Make of that what you will, he says. God has been leading, hasn't he? And God has led you in so many different ways. Thoroughly trust in God instead of in yourself. Satan would want us to trust in ourselves. Haman has this spiritual father, Satan, and Haman was a guy that wanted everybody to bow down to him. He didn't want to be second best to anybody except for the king. And we find that Satan is much the same way. He wants a person's allegiance, and he wants to cause them to give him glory. Now, we are not a match for Satan on our own. But because the Holy Spirit lives inside us, he is greater than what Satan is. It says in 1 John 4:4, the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. So we need to trust in God. When we do it ourselves, we oftentimes fail. But when we trust in him, we know that he has our back. We know that he has these things being worked out. In Esther 9:25, kind of recapping, it says, the king issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on his own head. That's the way God works. God traps Satan in his own scheme. And I think that's pretty cool to know that. You realize that every nation that has gone against God's people has failed in some way or another. That's still going to be true today. Any nation or group that goes against God's people will eventually fail and be brought to nothing. Number 4, God is more interested in your availability than your ability. If Esther would have played it safe, she would have lost her life. And God would have used somebody else, but she got in on what God was doing right there. She saved her nation. She spoke up when she could have been quiet. She risked using her voice to stave off disaster and to save her people. She could have said no, but instead she said yes and was even willing to put her life on the line. She couldn't do everything, but she could do something. And something she could do, she did. And you and I can't do everything, but we can do something. And so we should be doing something, should be prepared to do that. So what is God calling you to do today? What is God prompting you to do? Maybe you've had a prompting today, but maybe you've been having a prompting for a long time on something. Maybe it's just something you keep on having as a nagging thought. I need to do something about that. I need to follow through on that. I need to serve in this way. I need to make a difference in this way. I need to let God use me in this way. I would like to encourage you to not put that off. I would like to encourage you to say, if God is prompting me in this way, I need to respond to that and trust him that whatever that is, that he will be with me, and there will be positive results from that as well. What situation or place has he called you to? See, Esther's story is the story of God's providence, a queen's obedience, and the ultimate salvation of those people. And there was a reversal of a curse that was put against them. And sin has brought a curse into our lives, hasn't it? Every one of us has fallen short of God's glory. Every one of us has missed the mark. Every one of us has sin in our lives that will keep us out of heaven unless we surrender that to Jesus Christ. Unless we say, Jesus, you sacrificed for me on the cross. I want to surrender to you and to be able to receive that forgiveness and that salvation and that promise of eternal life. And so today, maybe you have been thinking about this for quite some time, and you're saying, I know I need to respond. I know I need to do something about it. Well, if that's the case, then I'm going to be back in the back by that Stepping Stones banner that's back there. If you would like to talk about giving your life to Christ today, or even placing your membership at our church, I would love to talk with you back over there so we can kind of, discuss and navigate how to do all that, all right? Let's stand together. Let's sing this song. You just go back there during the song, and I'll be happy to talk with you.